Architecture does not merely enclose human activity, it structures coordination. Research in environmental psychology and spatial anthropology shows that repeated exposure to constrained shared space alters human behavior long before it alters belief or ideology. When separation is physically impossible, coordination becomes automatic. Action adjusts to proximity before conscious decision intervenes. Viking longhouse architecture created precisely such conditions. Archaeological floor plans from Norway, Denmark, and Iceland show longhouses with interior widths typically between 6 and 7 meters. Within this width, wall benches, hearth zones, storage areas, and circulation paths overlapped rather than separated. When occupancy estimates are applied, usable movement corridors often narrowed to less than 2 meters in many sections. In behavioral terms, this is critical. Studies on pedestrian dynamics demonstrate that when passage width falls below 2.5 meters under continuous use, individuals stop navigating independently. Movement becomes anticipatory and synchronized. People slow, adjust posture, and time their steps relative to others rather than moving freely. This phenomenon has been documented in modern crowd research and applies regardless of cultural background. Inside Viking longhouses, this condition was not occasional. It was permanent. Because movement paths overlapped daily, bodies learned to coordinate implicitly. Individuals adjusted gait, posture, and timing to avoid collision without verbal exchange. These micro-adjustments accumulated into habitual patterns. Over time, coordination no longer required awareness. Behavior became relational by default. This had measurable consequences for how agency functioned. Experimental studies in shared workspace environments show that when individuals operate within continuously overlapping personal zones, decision-making shifts from intention-driven to context-driven. Actions are selected based on immediate spatial configuration rather than internal preference. The self does not disappear, but it acts through alignment rather than assertion. Viking domestic space reinforced this pattern through repetition. Unlike modern interiors that allow withdrawal, Viking longhouses provided no stable personal zones. Archaeological wear patterns show uniform foot traffic across the interior, indicating that no area functioned as a retreat or buffer. All zones were lived in, worked in, and passed through. As a result, rest itself became coordinated. Anthropological studies of communal dwellings show that in environments lacking physical separation, rest periods synchronize across occupants. Individuals rest when collective activity slows, not when personal fatigue peaks. Silence and stillness emerge collectively rather than individually. This synchronization was not scheduled. It was emergent. The absence of architectural separation collapsed personal rhythms into shared tempo. Wakefulness, work, and pause overlapped across the group. Attention remained partially outward even during stillness, because movement elsewhere in the space remained relevant. This altered how the body functioned as a unit of action. In spatial cognition research, the boundary of the self is partially defined by controllable space. When controllable space shrinks persistently, the perceived boundary of action extends outward. Individuals track the position and movement of others as part of their own operational field. In such conditions, the body does not end at the skin. It extends into the spatial behavior of others. This is not metaphorical. It is measurable. Studies using motion tracking in dense shared environments show that individuals begin to predict and incorporate others' movements into their own motor planning. Action becomes distributed across multiple bodies. Inside Viking longhouses, this distribution was constant. Over time, repeated coordination produced convergence. People moved similarly. They paused at similar moments. They adjusted posture and spacing in comparable ways. These similarities did not arise from instruction or discipline. They emerged from architectural constraint. Architecture rewarded synchronization. Movements that aligned with the collective flow required less effort. Movements that diverged produced friction. Over generations, such feedback shaped habitual behavior. Coordination became embodied rather than enforced. Children entered this system early. Developmental studies show that children raised in environments of constant shared space learn spatial behavior through imitation and adjustment rather than boundary assertion. They learn how to fit before they learn how to separate. In Viking households, children did not observe isolated adults interacting occasionally. They observed continuous coordination. They learned that effective action meant alignment. Individual positioning mattered less than relational positioning. This learning required no explanation. It was acquired through daily exposure. As these children matured, they did not experience the group as something external that constrained them. The group was the spatial condition within which action occurred. Identity developed functionally, defined by how one moved, paused, and acted within shared space. This is the origin of the shared body. Not a loss of individuality, but a transformation of it. The individual remained, but operated as a component within a coordinated system. Action was distributed. Agency was relational. The self existed, but not in isolation. Architecture did not impose this through rules. It trained it through repetition. And when architecture sustains such training across generations, humans do not merely live together. They function together. They become shared bodies. When behavior unfolds in uninterrupted shared space, norms form before rules. Research in behavioral sociology shows that human groups do not require formal enforcement to stabilize conduct. Under conditions of constant co-presence, acceptable behavior emerges through repetition and correction rather than instruction. The environment itself performs the work of regulation. Viking domestic space sustained precisely this condition. Inside the longhouse, actions did not occur in discrete social settings. There was no spatial transition between work, rest, interaction, or conflict. Because activities unfolded within a single continuous field, behavior was never context-specific. The same conduct applied everywhere. This had a compressive effect. Studies on norm formation demonstrate that when behavior is continuously visible across multiple contexts, variance narrows. Individuals abandon situational flexibility and adopt patterns that function across all moments. Speech becomes economical. Gesture reduces. Reaction time shortens. Behavior converges toward what is least disruptive across the widest range of situations. Inside Viking households, this convergence occurred daily. There was no private domain in which alternative behavior could be rehearsed. No secondary space where different norms applied. As a result, behavioral experimentation declined. What worked in shared space was repeated. What disrupted shared space faded. Norms emerged without declaration. Ethnographic research on communal living environments shows that groups stabilize behavior fastest when correction is implicit rather than explicit. Small cues, pauses, glances, shifts in posture signal deviation more efficiently than verbal sanction. Over time, individuals internalize these cues and adjust preemptively. In the longhouse, such cues were unavoidable. Behavioral alignment did not depend on fear of punishment. It depended on predictability. Actions that disrupted collective rhythm introduced friction. Actions that fit reduced effort. Over time, efficiency selected for conformity. This selection occurred below conscious awareness. People did not decide to restrain themselves. They learned which behaviors flowed and which stalled. Regulation became practical rather than moral. This process reshaped emotional expression. Psychological studies show that prolonged emotional display in shared environments increases social load. It draws attention, interrupts coordination, and demands response. In environments lacking retreat, such displays become costly. Inside Viking domestic space, emotion did not disappear. It shortened. Expressions became brief, contained, and situationally timed. Anger flared and subsided quickly. Grief appeared in compressed form. Excitement was muted. Not because emotion was forbidden, but because extended expression interfered with collective function. Over time, this pattern solidified. Normative behavior favored emotional economy. Individuals learned not what they were allowed to feel, but how long feeling could be expressed without disrupting the group. Importantly, this regulation did not rely on hierarchy. Because authority figures occupied the same space, they were subject to the same constraints. Leadership operated within shared norms rather than above them. Behavioral stability did not require constant intervention. It emerged through mutual adjustment. Comparative studies of leadership in shared space environments show that when leaders remain embedded rather than secluded, enforcement decreases while compliance increases. Norms are maintained through visibility and repetition rather than command. Children learned this system implicitly. Developmental research indicates that children raised in environments without private behavioral zones acquire norms through observation rather than instruction. They do not ask what is permitted. They infer what is workable. In Viking households, children observed continuous behavioral calibration. They learned which actions slowed the space and which allowed it to function. Self-control developed as pattern recognition, not discipline. This produced consistency. Across the household, behavior became compatible rather than identical. Individual differences remained, but they were expressed within narrow functional limits. Deviance did not vanish. It adapted. Behavioral studies show that in high-visibility environments, Deviance shifts from overt disruption to subtle withdrawal. Silence, stillness, and delayed participation replace confrontation. These signals communicate disengagement without destabilizing the group. Such signals require shared understanding. The longhouse cultivated that understanding. Through constant exposure, individuals became sensitive to minimal cues. Tone, timing, and posture carried meaning. Communication relied less on explicit statement and more on shared inference. This sensitivity was not a cultural trait imposed from above. It was a behavioral adaptation to space. Over time, the longhouse produced a population capable of regulating itself without formal rule systems. Control operated continuously, invisibly, and efficiently. Not through authority. Not through ideology. But through architecture that never allowed behavior to occur unseen. This is how shared space becomes shared control. And when control no longer needs to be asserted, individuals do not experience it as control at all. They experience it as the natural way to act. When separation never exists, individuality is not suppressed. It is never constructed in the first place. Anthropological research shows that the modern idea of the self-private, continuous, internally narrated is not a biological default. It is an environmental outcome. It emerges only where physical withdrawal is possible, often enough for inner experience to stabilize. Viking domestic architecture did not provide those conditions. Inside the longhouse, there was no recurring state of being alone. No spatial pause in which attention folded inward. Identity did not develop through reflection, because reflection had no physical container. The self was not something one retreated into. It was something one enacted. In such environments, individuality becomes operational rather than introspective. Cross-cultural studies of communal living societies demonstrate a consistent pattern. Where privacy is minimal, people do not describe themselves through internal traits or personal narratives. They describe themselves through roles, timing, and reliability. Who someone is becomes inseparable from what they do in relation to others. Identity anchors in function. A person is known not for what they think privately, but for how predictably they act within shared routines. Memory reinforces this structure. Instead of autobiographical recall shaped by solitary reflection, identity is recalled through participation. Tasks completed, moments shared, actions witnessed. The self exists publicly or not at all. Narrative psychology confirms this distinction. In high-privacy societies, identity is maintained through internal storytelling. People rehearse who they are by being alone with their thoughts. In low-privacy societies, rehearsal shifts outward. The self is reinforced by repeated engagement, not by inner narration. This produces a different experience of continuity. Instead of a stable inner self persisting across contexts, identity becomes situational. It activates when required and recedes when not. A person does not carry a constant internal identity through every moment. They step into identity through action. Importantly, this does not eliminate personal difference. Difference persists, but it is not emphasized. It appears through subtle variation in execution rather than explicit assertion. Through timing rather than declaration. Through reliability rather than expression. Anthropological observation shows that in such environments, individuality is not expressed by standing apart, but by fitting precisely. Distinction emerges through competence, not contrast. This has profound consequences for emotional life. Without private space, emotion cannot be prolonged internally or externally. There is no spatial buffer for extended introspection. Feelings are experienced, but not elaborated into personal narratives. They pass through action rather than accumulating into identity. Emotion does not become identity. It becomes event. Children raised in these conditions internalize this structure early. Developmental research shows that when children grow without consistent opportunities for solitude, they do not form identity by separating themselves from others. They form it by calibrating themselves to shared presence. They learn when to advance, when to withdraw, and when to remain neutral. The self becomes a tool for alignment, not a possession. As adults, these individuals do not experience this as loss. There is no remembered alternative. The absence of privacy does not feel like deprivation. It feels like normal existence. This is the crucial point. From within the system, nothing appears missing. The longhouse does not crush individuality. It prevents a certain kind of individuality from ever forming. There is no internal exile to return from. No private self waiting behind behavior. Instead, there is a self that only makes sense in use. A self that emerges through participation. A self that dissolves when participation ends. This is what it means to become a shared body. Not bodies moving together, not behavior aligned. But personhood distributed across presence, humans remain distinct. But distinction is no longer anchored inward. It is anchored in function. And when architecture sustains that condition across generations, individuality does not disappear. It is replaced. Not by obedience, not by conformity, but by a form of selfhood that cannot exist alone.